In the heart of Texas, under a scorching sun and behind rows of barbed wire, a group of captured German soldiers picked up their shovels, not to build fortifications, but a church. It was 1943, and the world was burning. Yet inside Camp Hearne, a prisoner of war camp far from the European front, something extraordinary began to take shape. These men had once fought for Hitler's army, marched under the black and white flag of the Reich, and seen death in deserts, forests, and bombed cities. But here, thousands of miles from home, they were just numbers stitched onto khaki uniforms, prisoners of war in the land of their enemies. The Texas wind carried dust across the compound. The camp fences rattled like iron reminders that they were no longer soldiers, just captives waiting for a war to end. But as weeks turned into months, one small group decided to build something that didn't belong to war. They gathered scrap wood, stones, cement, and fragments of hope. Piece by piece, they began constructing a chapel, a German church in the middle of Texas. It wasn't approved at first. American guards watched with suspicion. "What are they building?" one asked. "A bunker? A shrine to Hitler?" But as the walls rose higher, so did curiosity. The POWs carved angels out of cement, painted stained glass windows with improvised colors, and built an altar from discarded crates. Inside those wire fences, faith and forgiveness began to replace bitterness and pride. What started as a symbol of defiance slowly became a testament to shared humanity, proof that even in captivity, the soul could still reach for the divine. When the war ended, the church still stood, silent, weathered, and built by the hands of men who once fought their builders. By 1943, the tides of World War II were shifting. In North Africa and Europe, Allied forces had begun pushing the German military back. Thousands of Axis soldiers, weary, hungry, and disillusioned, were captured and shipped across oceans to camps scattered across the United States. Among them were German prisoners of war sent to Camp Hearne, a sprawling compound deep in central Texas. To most Americans, Texas was a place of open plains, long summers, and cattle ranches. But to these captured men, it was another world entirely, a land of dust, heat, and foreign words. Camp Hearne held more than 4,000 German POWs, guarded by American soldiers who were often little older than the prisoners themselves. Rows of wooden barracks stretched across the dry earth. The prisoners were assigned daily labor, building roads, harvesting crops, or maintaining camp facilities. Despite the fences, many were treated under the Geneva Convention, receiving food, mail, and even access to basic education. But life behind wires still carried a different kind of weight, not of hunger or cruelty, but of emptiness. These men were far from home, their loyalties fractured between a collapsing Reich and a quiet longing for normalcy. Many didn't know if their families were alive or what had become of the towns they left behind. To fight the silence, they built a community. They organized small orchestras, theater groups, and soccer teams. They printed newsletters and taught classes in engineering, languages, and art. The camp, in a strange way, became a small mirror of the homeland they had lost, yet something deeper stirred among them, a spiritual hunger that work and play couldn't fill. For many, faith was the last thing that still connected them to home. The idea came quietly. A few men discussing it one evening inside their barrack, using candles for light and voices barely above a whisper. They would build a chapel. At first it sounded impossible. They had no official permission, no real tools, and no materials. The Americans wouldn't allow construction without approval, and the war had made everything scarce. But the thought refused to fade. The prisoners saw the project not as rebellion, but redemption, a way to prove to themselves that they were still human, not just soldiers in disgrace. Over time, the idea reached the camp's commanding officer, an American who, perhaps out of compassion or curiosity, allowed it. But it came with conditions. The structure had to remain small, humble, and built entirely from discarded materials. So they began to scavenge. From broken crates, cement sacks, leftover lumber, and scrap metal, they gathered what others threw away. Their engineers drew blueprints on cardboard. Their artists sketched murals on the backs of ration sheets. Men who had once operated tanks now carried buckets of sand. Soldiers who had followed orders on the battlefield now followed the rhythm of hammer and stone. Each day, the Texas sun bore down on them as they worked in silence. There were no priests in the camp, only faith. As the walls rose higher, so did morale. Even some guards stopped to watch. The project began to draw attention from nearby townspeople, who were astonished that their former enemies were building a house of worship, not a symbol of defiance, but of peace. By late 1944, a small chapel stood in the corner of the compound, simple, elegant, and unmistakably European in its design. The men called it Die Kirche von Hearne, the Church of Hearne. Inside, crude benches lined the dirt floor. A cross, hand-carved from pine, stood at the front. The windows were painted to resemble stained glass, glowing when the Texas sun passed through them. And for the first time in years, many of these men knelt, not before their commanders, but before God. The war outside still raged, but within those fences, a strange peace had begun to bloom. The chapel soon became more than a building. It became a sanctuary of identity, a reminder of who they once were before the war devoured their lives. For the prisoners of Camp Hearne, each brick carried meaning. It wasn't merely faith that bound them together, but the act of creation itself, the proof that beauty could still be born inside barbed wire. Yet not everyone saw it that way. Among the German prisoners were men of vastly different beliefs, some die-hard Nazis who still swore loyalty to Hitler, and others who had grown weary of war and wanted nothing more than peace. The chapel project began to draw a line between the two groups. To some, the idea of building a church on American soil was betrayal. They whispered that it was weakness, that their comrades had forgotten the fatherland. A few tried to sabotage the work, spreading rumors, mocking those who prayed, even tearing down decorations at night. But the builders refused to stop. "This is not for Germany," one man told a guard. "This is for our souls." The conflict inside the camp mirrored the conflict within Germany itself, a struggle between faith and fanaticism, humanity and pride. Even the American guards could sense the tension. They kept a closer watch, fearing violence might erupt among the prisoners. One afternoon, the tension reached a breaking point. A group of prisoners, loyal to the Nazi cause, confronted the men at the chapel. "You kneel for your God," one spat, "while our brothers die for the Reich." Voices rose, fists clenched, and for a moment, the chapel that symbolized peace nearly became a battlefield. But something unexpected happened. The camp chaplain, an American officer who had quietly supported the project, intervened. He reminded both sides that the war would end someday. And when it did, every man would have to face not just history, but his own conscience. His words struck deeper than punishment ever could. The confrontation ended not with violence, but with silence. A silence that felt heavier than shouting. In the weeks that followed, more prisoners began to visit the chapel. Some came out of curiosity, others out of guilt. They prayed not for victory, but for home. They prayed for mothers, wives, and children whose faces had faded from memory. And in rare moments, they prayed for forgiveness, from their enemies, from God, and from themselves. The Americans, too, began to change. At first, many had viewed the POWs with suspicion or disdain. They were the enemy, after all, men whose country had brought the world to the brink of ruin. But as the chapel took shape, it stirred something unexpected in the guards. They saw the prisoners not as faceless soldiers, but as men, skilled, disciplined, and strangely humble in their captivity. The walls that divided captor and captive began to blur. Guards sometimes shared small kindnesses, extra rations, a cigarette, A friendly word through the fence. By early 1945, news of the German church in Texas began to spread beyond Camp Hearne. Local townspeople, at first wary of the POWs, started to visit during Sunday services. They were astonished at the craftsmanship, intricate carvings, hand-painted murals, a steeple fashioned from salvaged tin. The prisoners sang hymns in German, their voices rising softly over the Texas plains. It was haunting and beautiful. But even as faith united some, the world beyond those fences was collapsing. Reports filtered in. Allied troops advancing into Germany, the destruction of Berlin, and the suicide of Hitler. The Reich was gone. The soldiers who had once sworn eternal loyalty to it now found themselves with no homeland to defend, no flag to salute, no cause left to die for. Inside the camp, the emotional weight was immense. Some prisoners wept quietly when they heard the war was over. Others refused to believe it. A few destroyed Nazi insignia they had hidden for years. Others clung to them like relics of a broken faith. Through it all, the chapel remained untouched. The one place where enemies, believers, and doubters could stand together without a word. Then came the order from Washington. Repatriation would begin. The men would be sent home, to a Germany divided, bombed, and unrecognizable. For many, the thought of leaving the chapel behind felt like abandoning a part of themselves. They had built it as prisoners, but it had freed them in ways they couldn't explain. The day before their departure, hundreds gathered inside for one final service. The chapel overflowed, men standing shoulder to shoulder, some holding small crosses carved from scrap wood. The German chaplain, once a field medic, delivered a final sermon about forgiveness and redemption. "War ends," he said, "but the wounds of war live in the heart. Only we can choose what grows in their place." Outside, the Texas wind carried their last hymn into the horizon. Ein feste Burg ist unser Gott. A mighty fortress is our God. The final weeks of Camp Hearne carried a strange stillness, the kind that follows a long storm. News of Germany's surrender had arrived. The swastika was gone from Europe, and the men behind the wire finally understood. The war that had defined their entire existence was over. But peace did not come easily. It rarely does. The prisoners, now no longer soldiers but displaced men, were haunted by questions. What awaited them back home? Would their families still be there? Would they return as sons or as strangers? For many, Germany had ceased to exist in the form they remembered. Bombed cities, lost fathers, starving mothers, and the shadow of guilt. In those uneasy days, the chapel became the soul of the camp. Every morning, the prisoners cleaned its small yard, polished the altar, and repainted the fading walls. They did not know who would come after them, but they wanted the chapel to endure, a testament that something sacred had been born from captivity. Then came the final inspection. American officers arrived to prepare the camp for closure. They walked through barracks and fences, checking inventories and schedules. When they reached the chapel, they stopped in silence. Inside, sunlight filtered through colored glass, painting soft patterns on the stone floor. One of the officers, a stern man from Ohio, removed his cap. "You built this?" he asked a prisoner standing nearby. The German nodded. "For God," he replied softly, "and for peace." It was a small sentence, but it carried the weight of a generation. As the weeks passed, trains began to arrive. Prisoners were called by number, loaded onto trucks, and driven to the rail station. Some left with tears. Others stood in silence, looking back at the chapel through the wire one last time. The American guards who had watched them for years now stood by quietly, saluting them not as enemies, but as men. One night, before the last group was set to leave, the chapel's bell, fashioned from an old artillery shell, rang across the camp. Its sound was deep, raw, and full of memory. The prisoners gathered inside for a final service. They sang the same hymn that had carried them through the darkest nights. A former engineer named Carl, who had led the construction, stood at the front. His voice trembled as he spoke. "When we arrived, we built fences. When we stayed, we built walls. When we learned, we built a church. And in doing so, we built a bridge, one no army could destroy." Even the guards outside listened in silence. The war had taken so much: fathers, brothers, homes. Yet here, in a forgotten corner of Texas, something unexplainable had been created. The next morning, as the last prisoners boarded their trucks, the chapel doors remained open. The wind moved through the empty benches, stirring the dust. A Bible lay on the altar, left behind intentionally, with a note inside that read, "May peace live where we once could not." When the Americans closed the camp, they couldn't bring themselves to tear the chapel down. Instead, they fenced it off, leaving it as it was, a relic of grace built by the enemy's hands. Years passed, the fences rusted, the barracks collapsed. The world moved on, building highways and cities over the places where war had once echoed. But the chapel endured. Locals began to call it the church the prisoners built. Tourists who visited decades later were astonished to learn that its creators had been German soldiers, men who had fought against the very flag that flew above Texas. For many who came to see it, the chapel was no longer just a structure. It was a story of guilt and grace, pride and humility, destruction and creation. It reminded people that peace is not born when wars end, but when hearts decide to change. And in that forgotten corner of Texas, surrounded by tall grass and the faint hum of crickets, the church built by captives became a monument to freedom. When the last guards left Camp Hearne and the barbed wire came down, the Texas wind carried away the final echoes of the war. The fields grew wild again, swallowing the outlines of the barracks, the watchtowers, and the dirt paths where thousands of German prisoners had once marched in silence. Only one structure refused to disappear: the chapel. It stood there, quiet and weathered, its plaster cracked, its wooden door leaning with age. But the cross was still there. The colors on the stained glass had faded, yet sunlight still found its way through. Locals who stumbled upon it after the war called it a miracle, a piece of Europe left behind in the heart of Texas. Some of the German prisoners returned years later. They were old men by then, fathers, grandfathers, some even pastors. They came to see the little church they had built as young soldiers. For many, it was the first time they had set foot in America since captivity. They stood in silence, touching the rough stone, remembering faces long gone. One of them, now gray-haired and frail, whispered to a journalist, "We built it for God, but I think He built it for us." The town of Hearne slowly adopted the chapel as part of its own history. School children visited it on field trips. Veterans groups restored its walls. Historians wrote about it as one of the few surviving monuments built by enemy hands on American soil, not as a trophy of war, but as a tribute to peace. And yet, its deeper meaning reached beyond history. It spoke to something that every war tries to erase: the quiet, unbreakable bond between creation and redemption. Those prisoners, stripped of freedom and purpose, had found both again by building something that outlived their defeat. Today, the chapel still stands, a few miles outside the modern town, surrounded by open fields and rustling trees. Tourists who visit often say they can feel the stillness inside, as if the walls themselves carry the prayers of the men who built it. It's not a grand cathedral. There are no golden domes or marble floors. Just rough cement, wooden benches, and hand-carved symbols of faith. But that simplicity is what makes it powerful. It was built by the hands of soldiers who once brought destruction. Yet here, they built peace. For decades, historians have asked why they did it. Some say it was an act of repentance. Others call it homesickness, a yearning for normal life in a world gone mad. But maybe it was something simpler. the human need to create meaning, even when surrounded by despair. In the end, the chapel at Camp Hearne remains more than a story about prisoners. It's a reminder that even in the darkest corners of war, humanity can still rise, not in victory but in forgiveness. And as the Texas sun sets behind it each evening, the light falls through the faded glass, scattering color onto the walls. It's the same light that shone on those prisoners long ago, men who came as enemies and left as builders. In the silence that follows, the church still remembers.